The Whispering Forest. The rain had stopped just a little while ago. Now the forest was wrapped in a thin layer of mist, like a pale blanket lying close to the ground. Droplets still clung to branches and leaves, catching what little light there was and turning it into tiny, quiet stars. Elias walked along the narrow path, listening to the faint sounds of water sliding down bark and dripping into the soil. He liked this forest. He liked it most when the world was almost silent, when the sky was heavy with clouds, and when everything felt just a little bit unreal. The forest never became completely still. Even on nights like this, when there was no wind, it felt awake, not dangerous, just aware. He paused and took a slow breath. The air was cool and damp, filled with the smell of wet leaves and earth. Behind him, the path disappeared into gray mist. Ahead of him, it did the same. It always felt like this forest went on forever. Elias took another step. His shoes sank softly into the muddy ground, making no harsh sounds, only a gentle squish that faded almost instantly. Somewhere, far off, a bird called once and then fell silent, and underneath all of that, almost too soft to notice, there was something else, a whisper. At first, he thought it was just the sound of distant water, but as he stood there, listening, he realized it wasn't quite the same. Water had a rhythm. This was different. This came in slow, quiet waves, like someone speaking from very far away. He tilted his head slightly, closing his eyes to listen more carefully. The whispering didn't become louder, but it became clearer. It wasn't one voice, it was many, soft, breathy, as if the forest itself was trying not to wake anyone. Elias didn't feel afraid. A long time ago he might have, but he had walked this path many nights now. Every time, the forest sounded a little more familiar, like a place that remembered him. He took a few more steps. The mist curled around his legs, cool and gentle. The trees rose tall on either side, their trunks dark and damp, their branches weaving together above him like a slow, patient ceiling. The whispers followed him. Sometimes they grew a little stronger. Sometimes they faded until he wasn't sure they were there at all. But they never completely disappeared. He had tried, once, to pick out actual words, to understand what they were saying. It never worked. The moment he tried too hard, the whispers slipped away, like water between his fingers. He had learned that they were easier to hear when he didn't chase them, when he just walked and breathed and let the forest be whatever it was. Now he simply accepted it. The forest whispered. He listened. That was enough. He reached a curve in the path, marked by an old crooked tree that leaned over as if bowing. Its bark was split and rough, covered in dark green moss that glowed faintly in the fading light. Elias rested his hand against the trunk. "Good evening," he said softly. His voice sounded small in the thick air, but it didn't feel out of place. The forest absorbed his words, and for a brief moment the whispering grew a little louder, a little closer. Not angry, not surprised, just answering. He smiled to himself and moved on. The deeper he walked, the darker it became. The sky above him was only a pale suggestion now, hidden behind branches and leaves. Here and there droplets fell, landing on his shoulders, in his hair, on the path ahead of him. He listened to the way they landed, soft, small, like tiny footsteps keeping him company. After a while he noticed something. Between the whispers there were pauses, slow, stretched-out silences that felt almost intentional, as though the forest were waiting for something or someone. He came to another familiar spot, a small clearing where the trees stepped back just enough to reveal a gentle patch of pale light. It was faint, like the ghost of a moonbeam, but it was always there, even on the cloudiest nights. Elias stopped in the center of the clearing and closed his eyes. Here, the whispers were easier to hear. They moved around him in loose circles, never quite touching, never quite leaving. Sometimes it felt like they were walking past him, as if invisible figures were sharing the path, drifting by on their way to somewhere else. He didn't open his eyes. He didn't need to. The forest was not trying to scare him. It was just speaking in the only language it knew. Soft rustles, gentle creaks, breaths that sounded like wind even when there was no wind. He stood very still and listened. In the distance he heard a low creaking sound, like an old branch shifting under its own weight. Closer the soft drip of water continued, and underneath it all, that constant faint murmur. If he focused not on the sound but on the feeling of it, it almost felt like memory, old and patient, as if the forest remembered every footstep that had ever passed through it, every whisper that had ever been spoken into its branches. "You remember me, don't you?" Elias asked quietly. The whispering didn't form words, but it changed. For a heartbeat it seemed to lean in. The sound gathered, not louder but thicker, more present, like a crowd of people taking a silent step closer. Elias felt a gentle, familiar chill run down his back, not the sharp fear of danger, but the soft shiver of being noticed, of being seen. "Thank you," he said, though he wasn't sure what he was thanking the forest for. Maybe for not being empty. Maybe for whispering when the rest of the world was too loud. Maybe for letting him feel small without feeling alone. He opened his eyes slowly. The clearing looked just as it always did. The same trees, the same moss, the same strip of pale light across the ground. He took a slow breath and sat down on a flat stone at the edge of the clearing. The stone was cool, but not uncomfortable. He folded his hands in his lap and listened. Time moved differently here. Minutes stretched, turning thin and soft. The forest breathed. The whispers rose and fell. Sometimes he thought he heard laughter in them, very quiet and distant, like a memory of someone laughing long ago. Sometimes he thought he heard sighs. Sometimes it felt like the forest was telling him stories, but in a way he couldn't quite understand. Stories in a language made of sounds and pauses instead of words. That was all right. He wasn't here to understand. He was here to be. Slowly the mist began to thicken, turning the edges of the trees soft and blurry. The forest around him faded into shapes and shadows as if someone had taken a charcoal drawing and gently smudged it. The whispers softened with it, becoming slower, deeper, sleepier. Elias felt his shoulders relax. His breathing matched the rhythm of the forest. In, out, in, out. Every breath seemed to sink into the moss, into the roots, into the quiet earth. From somewhere far away, an owl called once. Its voice echoed briefly and then disappeared into the gray. The forest answered with another sigh of whispers. Elias closed his eyes again. He let the sounds wash over him. The invisible voices moving. Through the branches, the soft dripping of rain, the faint, slow creaking of wood settling in the cool night. The longer he listened, the more the forest seemed to slow down with him, as if it were falling into the same gentle rhythm, as if it were keeping watch while he rested. His thoughts became lighter, looser. They drifted in and out like the mist curling between the trees. He wondered, for just a moment, who the forest was whispering about. Was it whispering about him? About others who had walked this path long before him? About things that had happened when the trees were young? The whispers didn't answer, but they stayed close. Slowly his head dipped forward. If he dreamed of tall trees and quiet moss, of gray mist and soft voices that never became words. He dreamed of footsteps that left no prints, of branches that bent without breaking, of a forest that watched over him with patient, silent eyes. And all around him the forest continued to whisper, not to frighten, not to warn, just to remind him that even in the deepest quiet he was not alone.